Não. Aí, pronto.
Acerta o zoom só. Mano, deixa eu só na cara desse gordo, velho. Não, peraí. Aqui no filho. São quantas pessoas? São quantas pessoas? A gente pode deixar assim.
Religious Studies Forum. We're going to talk about the afterlife, I believe. Very interesting topic. My name is Nathan Ponder. I'm chair of the Metaphysical Sciences Department, and Holly Wilson, who's chair of the Arts, English, and Humanities Department, which the World Religions program is in. As we come up here and give a little introduction. I guess the main reason I'm here is a few years back I was interim chair of the AEH department, and then Holly came on board, and we sort of worked together to establish the World Religions degree program here at LSUA. A lot of people helped out in the effort. Probably the most important of which is Gary Baldwin, who's on our panel this afternoon. So I want to take just a moment to introduce our panelists. Gary Baldwin is a native of Southwest Missouri. He did a PhD in Biblical Studies at Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth. He's been a pastor for a number of years, the last 20 years here in Central Louisiana at First Baptist of Pineville, and then later currently at New Life Community Church. Pastored in other churches before that. Also on the panel is Rabbi Cantor Raina Sarati. Well, Rabbi grew up in Los Angeles. She's currently Rabbi at Congregation Gemmelith Chassidim here in Alexandria. She earned her Bachelor of Music and Voice at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And master's degrees, a couple of master's degrees, one in sacred music and the second in Hebrew letters at Hebrew Union Jewish Institute of Religion. She's ordained as a cantor and also as a rabbi and has served congregations in California, Ohio, New York, and New Jersey. Next we have Father Adam Travis. He's currently pastor at St. Martin Catholic Church in LeCount and Our Lady of Guadalupe in Forest Hill. He has degrees from LSU and Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio. And he's currently working on a licentiate in canon law at Catholic University in Washington. We have a fourth panelist who we're expecting to arrive. I'll go ahead and introduce him. He's not here yet. Imam Munir Borkisa. He's the director of the Islamic Center of Islamic Society of Central Louisiana. And formerly he was had a similar position in South Florida. And he's currently working on a PhD in educational leadership at Florida Atlantic University. And also I want to introduce Eamon Halpin, our Assistant Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, who's going to moderate for us today. So appreciate all of you all agreeing to come and speak today. Okay.
So I've been thinking about this question, is there life after death? For the last few days since Dr. Wilson asked me to moderate the panel. I've probably been thinking about my entire life. But I've been thinking in particular about how the question has been framed. Is there life after death? And it strikes me now that there's something peculiar about the question. Something, no offense, Dr. Wilson, but there is something a little odd about asking the question in that way. It's almost so, is there life after death? It's almost as if we're asking about something that is separate from ourselves. This thing called life, it's a kind of, when we talk about it as life, it's an abstraction. And it reminds me a bit of other kinds of questions. You know, is there life on Mars? Do UFOs exist? You know, I think when we ask that question, is there life after death, we're really asking about our own lives, right? We ask it, you know, so do we persist in some form or fashion after death? Or do we just face extinction? Do we just dissolve into nothingness at the end of life? Or do we continue? Do we persist in some way? And so really, when we ask the question that way, perhaps it has more relevance and perhaps more urgency for us. Maybe that's why we don't ask it that way. But I think it's really an anthropological question. It's a question about the human being. What does it mean to be a human being? Right? Do we? Does the human being continue in some way after death? So, sort of having reframed the question in that way, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to briefly indicate what his or her faith tradition has to say about this matter, the matter of life after death. Do human beings persist in some way after death? And maybe we can start with someone who wasn't here for our last panel discussion, someone who's new to Alexandria. No, Rabbi Sarodi.
Thank you, God. Can I come up to there?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine, quickly.
Yes.
A little quicker. Okay. So, the question, is there life after death? So, is there an afterlife? So, texts in every era of Jewish life identify a world where people go when they die. In the Bible, in Torah, it is an underworld called Sheol. But Sheol, in the way that we define it, is more like a metaphor for like oblivion than an actual place where the deceased people live. In the rabbinic tradition, it's known by a number of names, including Yeshiva Shamala, which is like the school on high. And the Hebrew word for sky, Shemayim, also is another name that refers to heaven. So we have one of the proof texts for coming back to life would be Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. And this particular verse, implies that resurrection will be followed by a day of judgment, and that those who are judged favorably will live forever, and those that are wicked will be punished. And we date the Daniel text to 2nd century BCE, before the Common Era, and at some point during the 2 centuries that followed, another afterlife idea entered Judaism, the immortality of the soul, the notion that the human soul lives on even after the death of the body. And so the idea of the afterlife, the afterlife can take many forms. So the afterlife is diverse as Judaism itself, that from the traditional view of the unity of flesh and spirit in a resurrected body, to the idea that our souls live on in our children and grandchildren, to a sense of heaven. And that the idea of the afterlife here on earth is that heaven is a transitory place where souls reside after death. They reside there until they reunite with their physical bodies at the time when the Messiah comes. And I'm sure that will be something that we will discuss in a little bit more detail. I'm sure that you'll have on questions. So, as there are many different ideas of the afterlife, and many different denominations might feel a little differently one way or another, that I'm a Reform rabbi, which means that I am the group of Jews that are the least observant to the mitzvot, the commandments that are in Torah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are less religious. We are just less observant of the mitzvot that are commanded of us. And my prayer book expresses that we live on through others after we die. So there's this metaphor of a leaf and a tree. So a leaf drops to the ground, and it nourishes the soil so that more plants and trees can spring up. And the same is true with our lives, that we nourish the future through the influence we have on those who follow us. And this can happen in unimaginable ways. And as far as the idea of heaven, that Jews and Judaism believes that there is this open door policy, that heaven is not a gated community, that the righteous of any people or of any faith have a place in heaven. And our actions, not our specific beliefs, determine our fate. We also do not believe in the concept of hell, and the closest that we get to the fate of perhaps going to somewhere that would be less desirable, would be the fate of an apostate. So someone who renounces God, faith, and mortality, and morality in this world, and someone who we say has been cut off from his or her kin. So I'm sure that we will go into a little bit more detail of that as the rest of the panelists speak.
So it just seemed that from what the rabbi was saying, that there is not only diversity among the various faith traditions, but perhaps some diversity and plurality within traditions.
Absolutely, we will definitely talk about that.
So within Judaism, there are different views, not necessarily conflicting views, but they might be views that complement each other. And I think some of the ideas that the rabbi mentioned are very familiar, right? The idea of judgment or some kind of reckoning after death. The idea of the resurrection of the body is something that probably Judaism has in common with Catholicism. The idea of the immortality of the soul, right? These are all, I think, quite recognizable to us. We'll come back later and maybe dig a little deeper on some of those ideas. Perhaps, Dr. Baldwin, would you like to follow the rabbi? Tell us.
You want to remain seated? Or?
You may. Either you can remain seated, you can stand, and just tell us what your tradition. Dr. Baldwin is a Baptist pastor, so what does your tradition have to say about all of this?
Let me share with you. Beginning with terms, I think we're going to ask about life and death. Probably ought to know what you're talking about before you begin when or after, those type of things. And with the concept of life, you understand legally that can't be defined. You don't know when is consciousness, when the heart starts, when the brain starts, where does it begin? That's debated legally and medically. And legally and medically, they can't define anymore when life stops. That take off a ventilator, or is it when the brain waves, the heart quits pumping, the muscles don't react. And so I'll be going, I think, beyond law and beyond medicine. And since my faith tradition is, Bible is a key source for us, I want to look at, regarding life, 4 terms. I'm a professor, so if you're taking notes, I'll give you 4 terms. And starting in the Pentateuch with Genesis, and then moving the New Testament with 2 other terms. Life in Genesis 1, in the first of the 2 creation accounts. There's one in Genesis and one in chapter 1 and a different one in chapter 2. But life is defined in Genesis 1:26 and 7 as the image and likeness of God. When does the image and likeness of God begin or cease in a created being? And usually the scholars, Old Testament and some New Testament, define image and likeness of God as uprightness, but usually the ability to think, consciousness. Usually it has to do with character and morality. I can sense what's right and what's wrong. It's the ability to act and engage and control. So those are some of the things. When does the image and likeness of God begin? Or when does it cease as defining life? The second Old Testament or Pentateuch definition, and these are metaphoric, they're all picturesque, they're beyond saying something not less than literal, but far more than literal, is in Genesis 2:7. God breathed into mankind, and he became nephesh. It's translated living soul, but it's the life principle. It's the personality, the psyche, the real you that's not just contained in a body. So until about 1970, when the politicians got hold of defining life and playing their games, most of Christendom understood life began with this God breathing into you, not that you have a soul, but you are a soul. You are a unit. You are a oneness. Interesting enough, animals have nephesh, plants have nephesh, humans have nephesh. But it is a characteristic of God that defines life from an Old Testament point of view. When you move to the New Testament, beyond image and likeness and nephesh, you have two Greek terms that I think help us a whole lot with euthanasia and things like that. But you have the term bios, from which you get biology, and it means existence. And quite honestly, if bios just went on and on and on forever, that'd be horrible. I mean, I don't want to be 110, decrepit, on a ventilator, and no hope of that ending. You know, bios, just existence. To me, that'd be hell and torture. Who wants to? How many of you are over 102? Praise God, you don't want to be there. Social Security will run out a long time before you get that far. So there's all kinds of reasons. But bios is the idea of existence. Death, as understood from creation, is not the cessation of life. It's the transition to another kind of life. As you mentioned, life through your progenitor, your family, and things like that. Or you get to, I'm English, so I don't say my Hebrew. I say something Sheol, and I never pronounce it right. But death in Old Testament often is just transition to another form of existence. It's not just the ending of there. And that's all kind of bios. But, you know, my ideal time, if I could have stayed 28 all my life, well, 31, that's when I finished my PhD. I was healthy and young and married. I'd like to stay there. At 69, I long for some of those years in the future to know that I've got to exist. But the key term for life in New Testament is Zoe. John 10:10 defines it this way, is abundant life. It's a different kind of life. It's not defined by time and space. It's, I got to stand up to show this if it's okay. But Zoe is God's kind of life beyond time and space and limitation, breaking through into this world, incarnation, but God's kind of life breaking into the here and now so you can exist and you can have it. It's not mere existence of beating the grave or walking and talking, but it's living in a celestial realm. It's God's identity and God's kind of life in you. That's why sometimes it's called being born again or recreated or new made or adopted into the family. And it's a kind of life in the midst of disaster you can have joy. In the midst of chaos you can have peace. In the midst of everything going wrong, losing your eyesight, gaining weight, having arthritis or whatever, diabetes, there can be an inner peace and inner dwelling. But it is not bios of existence. It is a new kind of life. So I'm asking, when's that happen? I'm not too much about the word after. I don't know afterlife. I don't know when's life happen. Because God's beyond time and space, and His likeness and image is not time-oriented or physically space-oriented. It's Zoe. And the New Testament talks about you having God's kind of life living in you or abiding in you right now. In fact, if we get into issues, the kingdom of God is at hand. That is used over 100 times in the Gospels. Jesus' first sermon, last sermon, Sermon on the Mount, Lord's Prayer, all uses that. Is the kingdom of God is at hand now. So there must be an inception to it, and then a culmination. But all those biblical connotations of life are beyond time. They're beyond space. It's a new kind of existence. And those in my tradition who want to talk about you going to heaven when you die, I'm going to say, guys, would you please read your Gospels? You can have heaven now. It's not a concept that is linear. It's a concept of the presence of God in your life right now. The image and likeness, when does it come? You get to the, that's my first word, can I deal with death? Yes, thank you. And death, the Old Testament, you were created to die. Human beings, as in the cows, were going to die because death, this bodily, is a transition. It's not an end of existence. It's not cessation. When does the image and likeness of God stop? We'll probably come back to that one later. Death in the New Testament, there's some terms about physical dying, but the main term is thanatos. And thanatos, much like the Old Testament, cut off from God. You're severed from God. Has nothing to do about physical body. It's dead men walking. In fact, there's passages in Romans 1 that says, God says, okay, have it your way. I won't bother you, I won't irritate you, I won't prick your conscience anymore. I call it Burger King theology, have it your way. But you say, God turns them over to a depraved mind. He turns them over to lustful desires. He turns them over to go after anything they want. He says, oh, you're existing, you got bios. But Zoe is not the realm of possibility. You're dead man walking. Have it your way. Which is what a lot of America want. There's another passage in 1 Timothy 4. And it talks about the mind being seared. The mind being cut with heat. You're living. So many conscience. You don't care for anybody. It's all about you. It's self-centered. Your bios. But Zoe is not in the realm of possibility. Your mind's being seared. You'll not enjoy the presence of God. You'll not know the presence of God. You'll not in any way live within the presence of God. We get to heaven and hell, those other terms in a moment, because the question, are they state of being, or are they presence of God, or what? But you're asking, is it physical death, spiritual death, eternal death? I'm worried about the body. I'm worried about the image and likeness of God. The presence that's not limited by time and space being in me. And if it is, that's beyond the category of time. I don't want to ask about life after death. I want to ask when life begins. And then I'm going to quit. But we'll look at other terminology. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
I'm a preacher.
He has kind of addressed this. There's something, there's a mystery here we're trying to comprehend, and Dr. Baldwin has addressed it by introducing this distinction, between two aspects of the human being, bios on the one hand, which represents our physical existence, and then Zoe, which, and of course our physical existence is obviously limited, but Zoe represents something else that has no before or after, it's kind of eternal. And so that's one way to kind of address this whole conundrum, to think about the human being as a kind of duality. And that's an important part of the Christian tradition, but it's also an important part of Greek philosophy. It goes back to Plato. So we may come back to that distinction later. But I want to invite Father Travis now to talk about what the Catholic faith has to say about this whole question.
We're very pro afterlife. And we're 2,000 years now, so to speak, of scaring the hell out of our people. That's a method of evangelization. But really, to understand the Catholic position of it, I have to underline our faith as really being rooted in history, what we would describe as a historical truth, right? Things that we declare as true, that we receive in tradition, through Scripture, passed down to us. And one of that is that God created the world, and God is good, and God created the world good. Right? There's a basic goodness to creation. The second thing is Jesus Christ suffered, died, and rose from the dead, that testimony of the apostles and the disciples became the basis of our evangelization. What's the word that we're spreading? That he is risen, right? And for us, we never can let ourselves be separated from a historic testimony. Because if we don't, as a faith, take that as credible, then we're kind of untethered into the ether of ideas, right? So Catholicism is very much rooted in creation and in history, and those are foundational. Everything else, like most of y'all, we have greater fights within our community than we do with anybody outside the community. But we do have a strong Jewish tradition. One of the things you might have known at a certain age, that we would celebrate every November, the month of November, starting with All Hallows Eve, right? That would be Halloween. We would celebrate All Saints Day, November 1st. It's a kind of appropriation of ancient, and not just pagan, but just throughout the world, different understandings of death, relationship between this world and that world. Where do our ancestors go? How do we relate to our ancestors? How do we scare ourselves to pieces because fear of something coming back from the dead? All those things. November for us was a very liturgical and doctrinal celebration of the four last things, and those we got a lot of traction out of the four last things, and we still do, but sometimes not as much as we did. And the four last things that we believe is that we are historically rooted, because Jesus said this, and it was recorded, and we passed it down, and we believe it, that we are to be judged. That there's a thing called judgment at the end of our lives. The three other things are descriptions of different sort of realities. We have heaven and hell and purgatory. Everybody's favorite. Why do Catholics believe that? Purgatory. It's one of my favorites too. We'll let that be for question and answer. All right. So preaching, I say, okay, well, one day we're going to die. We're going to meet the Lord in judgment, and immediately what we call the particular judgment is at the moment of death. Particular meaning personal, me, my judgment, is that there is a judgment that the Lord makes based on our lives according to standards that are way beyond my ken. Heaven or hell, or heaven, kind of a side topic, is purgatory, right? Kind of like a mud room to heaven. And then there's the final judgment, which we believe at the end of the world. Again, we're very, very much, we're never going to leave that foothold we have in history, right? The historical timeline. That at the end of the world, Jesus is coming back, the Parousia, he's coming back, and there will be a final judgment with the resurrection. Everybody back to physical bodies, right? Hopefully glorified, like Christ, but and then separating, as the Lord will, one of the biblical terms that is kind of rough, sheep and goats, whatever you want, the good and the bad, however the Lord defines that, right? So creation is good. It's fallen through original sin. It's redeemed through the incarnation and the resurrection of the body. And then that's why at the moment of death we have this panic, because our body soul, for our incarnational thinking in Catholicism, that's the person, the body soul. You can't separate. You can't have a person without a body, without a soul. So what is death? Death is a tragic thing that rips apart what should be ripped apart. And we're anticipating and longing for a final resurrection when that is brought back to that original goodness and then elevated to something even higher, a supernatural goodness of creation in the human person. So, clear as mud. That's what we believe. We have a whole lot of argument about how many people are in hell. How do you know who's in hell? Da 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 da. But that's for another day.
So we heard from Father Travis that the Catholic view is influenced very much and rooted in the Christian understanding of human history and certain key events, the creation, the incarnation, the idea of God becoming man, and then the resurrection of Christ. And he also introduced some key distinctions that are important to Catholics, the idea of heaven and hell, and of course that in-between state, the mud room, purgatory, the idea of the particular judgment, the final judgment, the idea of the resurrection of the body. We've just been joined a few moments ago by Imam Munir Brzika. So I've invited each of the speakers just to give a brief account of what his or her faith tradition has to say about this question of life after death. The other three have already spoken.
Okay.
Are you ready to say your piece? Good.
Okay. First, I'm terribly sorry for being late. Not that I didn't want to be really excited to be here, actually, and I was looking forward to it. I just had the wrong timing on my calendar, so I do apologize for not being on time. I will try to clarify in a few points what Islam believes about life after death. We might start with the purpose. We believe in Islam that humans were created for a greater purpose. So it follows that living only a few years and then the body disappears is not achieving that greater purpose. So there is life of the soul after this body of ours is gone. We'll talk about a little bit of detail about that, but in general, that it serves this idea that there is a greater purpose than just living a few years on this earth. Also, it encourages people to do good and restrain from evil, because in believing that everything you do in this life has consequences beyond this world that pushes you to do good even if nobody perceives it as good, and to restrain from evil even if you can get away with it. Somebody, thinking that they can get away with the crime, if they know that there is actually reckoning after this life, then that should be as a deterrent from doing that. So these are some of the ideas about the purpose and about what is the significance of believing in life after death from an Islamic perspective. Now, when it comes to what happens and what is after, I want to say that there are, in Islam, there are 4 words besides, or 3 words besides the one we live in right now. So this is this world where everybody is, and we know it. We believe that there was a world before that. We're not going to talk about that today. But there is one that comes right after death. And in the Arabic term, it's called barzakh, which literally means barrier or intermediary state. So this is a world where the bodies are not existent. It's a world of the souls. And then there's the third or the last world, which is the hereafter, where there's only hellfire or paradise. So, in general, these are 3 different worlds that we believe in, and our concern today is about the second and the last one that I just spoke about, the intermediary state, and then the last one where there is hell and paradise. Very important to understand too that we believe that the soul is a separate entity by itself. It's not a part of the body. It's an independent, separate entity. So when it will come a time where it will leave the body. Now, what is the relation between the two? So we believe in this world, we cannot touch the soul, we cannot see it. But the laws, the physical laws, are applied on our bodies. And the soul feels that. The consequences of what is applied on the body is felt inside. If you're injured, God forbid, then you might feel sorrowful, or you might feel sad, or you might feel hurt. So that feeling is part of the soul. So whatever happens to our bodies is actually felt by our souls. And the second world, the intermediary state, the physical laws of that world are actually applied onto the soul. But the body feels it, even if we don't see the body at that time, and we don't, the body might have vanished at that point. Just like it's the inverse in this world. So, and the year after, as you mentioned, the body and the soul are reunited again, and the physical laws are applied to both. So you might feel the joy, or the person who's going to be punished feels the punishment in both the body and the soul. So when it comes to the last world, where there's only paradise or hellfire, we believe that there will be a day of judgment where God will resurrect everybody and will put these souls back into the body, and there will be a physical court where our deeds will be weighed. They will have a physical weight. There will be a scale. We don't know how the scale is, but we know that it will weigh our deeds. And we know that actions and things that we do in this world will take a physical shape and a physical form, and they will have a weight. And the basic understanding is, if your good deeds are more than your bad deeds, then that person is going to paradise. And if a person has more bad deeds than good deeds, then this person is going to hellfire. And there is nothing in between. So it's either this or that. So that is what, in general, some concepts about the soul in this world, the soul in the intermediary state, and then the soul and the body in the last world, where there's only hell and fire. So paradise and hell, actually. So this is just general concepts, and we can talk in detail about that in that question.
Thank you. So Munir kind of brought the discussion in the beginning back to the human, because he said that human life has a purpose, right? And that purpose, properly understood, the fulfillment of that purpose almost seems to require something after death, right? That sort of finite time that we have available to us is not sufficient for us to truly realize our purpose as human beings. I thought that was a very interesting point. And he also made the point about deterrence, that belief in the afterlife has a kind of practical, it's sort of useful in this world, as a kind of practical application, because it can deter, it can influence the way we behave, right? As you were talking, I remember something Archie Bunker said. You remember Archie Bunker? There was a show back in the 70s, All in the Family, and they were talking about capital punishment, and Archie said that he was in favour of it because it was a detergent to crime. But anyway, but that idea, that the idea that there's something after can sort of influence how we behave in this life. And then he also alluded to something that Dr. Baldwin alluded to, the idea of the duality of the human being, the body and the soul. But he mentioned that they're kind of integrated in a way, that what happens to the body, what the body might suffer, is felt in some way by the soul, and also vice versa, right? What the soul feels also manifests itself externally in our physical appearance. Okay, well, we're going to move on to another question. And so this is what I'm wondering. Could you set aside, I'm wondering, maybe you can't do this, but maybe you could try. If you could set aside the views of your particular faith tradition for a moment, and ask yourself this question. Is it plausible, that human beings persist in some way after death? If a person had no contact with any faith tradition, for instance, could he or she just sort of figure out that what we consider the end of life is not really the end of life, that human beings live on, persist in some form or fashion? Is it reasonable to, I don't know if we can ever have complete certainty about that, but is it plausible? Can one reasonably assume that? Maybe Father Travis could.
Yeah, I'm thinking. My brain.
Does the question make sense?
Oh yeah, no, it makes sense. How can we know? So you're asking me to pretend.
Yeah, just through the use of our own reason.
And we have them actually within our our history, our faith system. What can we know through human reason without revelation, right? So we bracket off revelation, say it's just me walking around the world. What can I see and know and think about anything divine? Famously, there's a scholastic argument back in the 12th and 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. St. Thomas Aquinas had his 5 ways, famously, of how to prove God's existence from reason. We won't get into that. That's a long that's a long argument still going on. But what we believe is yes, the human person can know God exists from human reason alone, but that's about it, right? That's the way we verbalize it. For myself, how would I describe how I see that stuff? You know, how would I think about God if I didn't have any revelation? Beauty is traditionally a divine attribute, but I'm already thinking about divine attributes that I've learned about. The sense of loss and grief when someone dies. The historical and multicultural, but the historical belief systems around the world throughout time, all looking towards something divine, something next. I even love vampire stories in the sense that there's something really creepy about it, but it's about the immortality of the person and what comes and what's there. That in all the data of human experience, as we recorded and shared and talk about, there's a deep, lasting theme about life and death and God. It might be theistic, it might be monotheistic, monistic, anything like that. But there's something in the human heart that longs for it, and I can only believe that it also knows it, can touch it barely. Just from a traditional sense, in our tradition, though, that God breaks through that wall, right? So we touch it.
Do you think that the longing for something is in and of itself an indication that the something exists?
Yeah. Thirst is a classic metaphor. To thirst for God, to be longing. That every human person in their heart longs to know the divine. And I even think that there is, in a declaration of atheism, that there's a metaphysical declaration that God does not exist. But there's still a thirst within that. I could posit seeing a similar that's divine thirst. You know, you come to a different conclusion, and there's a kind of scar tissue about it.
Would anyone else like to address that question? That just is the idea of life after death, again, bracketing off your particular religious faith, is it a plausible thing? Is it reasonable to assume that there's something? I mean, I know exactly what. Rabbi?
I mean, I think that I agree with a lot of what you said. I think the idea of living day to day when something is unexplainable, that faith, in whatever term that might be, exists within everyone. Because what would make the difference between living and dying day after day if there wasn't something to be on the earth for? And we can even tell by the way that we see mourning in animals that there's intrinsically within ourselves that there's something that keeps us going on day after day, and when that next day doesn't happen, that there is a feeling of the people that are around the person or thing that is passed that is inside of them to tell them that it's different from what it was the day before. So whatever that feeling is, that there's something that life as everyone knew it from before is now different now that something is passed.
Maybe I can ask the question in a slightly different way, Munir and Gary. I heard somebody say recently that what we believe as human beings is more evident in how we act than in what we say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So our actions are really more of an indication of what we really believe, what we know. So do we act as if, do we behave in this world as if there is something after, Gary?
Some do and some don't.
Yeah.
Same bet.
You
got law-abiding citizens.
What about the ones who don't then?
I think Protestants on the whole, which I think has been defined by these three, believe in general revelation, which is there is enough truth in creation, and you mentioned beauty or mountains or life or animals or plants or things, that there's something beyond what man can make and do by himself. And there's something beyond, we see people die, but this world goes on and there's life. And Scripture Isaiah indicates his ways are higher than our ways and beyond our capability of knowing or thinking. But in general revelation, there is this understanding that humans can know there is a God. And I think, as you alluded, all civilizations from Jarmo about 8,000 BC, they've all indicated a longing or defined or talked about some kind of God. Protestants on the whole understand special revelation is that it is the incarnation, God coming to this world, God breaking in, that we could know Him and experience Him, or that abundant life, that Zoe. That is when you begin experientially, existentially, knowing God and knowing more about God's defined four ways, God's love, God's life, God's light, God's truth. And when you begin, if it is made a new creation, you begin not only seeing but acting differently. I don't think if people who have experienced God or Zoe act any different. They proclaim to possess something they don't, that they're theological liars. There is a change, but I think that's that Zoe thing of experiencing a very special revelation here encounter with God. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Munir, just the same question. Do you think people generally act as if there is something that follows death, or do we act as if,
I think that is shown more in times of distress.
Okay.
You take a time of distress, when people have everything around them, they might be logical and they might have this faculty of choosing what they want. But in time of distress, we dig deep to see what we have inside. And most people, the majority will be at that time saying, "Oh God, help me." Or they might not say God, they might say, "If you are there, then get me out of this," and I will believe. Or they will say, for example, "Whoever you are, or whatever you are, just get me out of this to know that you are there." So I think that is a true testimony that inside each one of us, there is this longing for a greater creator and greater being than we are. So I think this is a proof, even for those who don't believe, they might be in that situation invoking God.
And I'm wondering, just people who commit terrible crimes,
Right.
perhaps even those people, maybe especially in those people,
Right.
one sees something. I don't know if you've read the Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. The young fellow Raskolnikov, and he kills this, pawnbroker, and he sort of convinces himself that he could just do this, and with impunity, and not suffer really because of it mentally or psychologically, but that's not the case.
Maybe a small other point is, as a prerequisite of having faith first, but those who invoke God, sometimes they see the realization of what they asked for in the material life. Like something specific that you asked for, and I'm sure that everyone here in this room have witnessed that you ask God for something specific that is not likely to happen, and then it happens in your life. And the chances of that to happen haphazardly are slim to none. But then you may ask, and then you ask again, and it happens again, and it happens again, and your answer, your questions, or what you're asking for is being answered in that very specific way that you asked for. that is a very strong proof that there is somebody there who's listening and giving you what you're asking for.
Amen. I think you can point to exceptions. I don't think you can make general statements. And I come back to the idea, have it your way. There is a time of point. God says, I won't bother, convict, again, have it your way. And there, you're given over, you're released, that you're not going to be bothered or the idea your conscience has been seared. There's a point. If that searing happens, you're not going to be worried, bothered, or concerned about that. That I think you could certainly point out some.
So there's a point of no return.
I think there's a point of no return. And I think for some it can be before physical death.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience. So maybe we can move kind of quickly on this, because I do want to give the audience an opportunity to talk to you. Relationship between the living and the dead. What is your faith?
I knew someone was going to bring up ghosts.
All right, who would like to address that?
I can go
Yes,
first.
yeah. Living and the dead.
Yeah, so we believe, our belief is actually contradictory to the major, the belief in the culture. We believe that when a person dies, their soul departs from this world. As I mentioned before, it goes to another world. And there is no way that there will be any contact between that soul and the living person, in the sense that, oh, they're going to come and show us who killed them, or, help their grandchild, achieve something greater in this world. We believe that there is a total separation.
So they can't intercede for us. The dead.
And in this life, no. The whole purpose of living this life is that you get a chance, it's a test, you have it all the way till you die. Once you die, you're done. The test is done. So there's no point for you to come back here and do anything. So you are somewhere else, waiting for the reckoning for what you have done in this life. There are a lot of questions that stem from this, that, we have the mediums that talk presumably to dead people. The answer of Islam to that is there are other creation besides humans and angels that are conscious creation. And we believe that is the jinn. It's another creation that Satan is from that. They're created from fire. They have the faculty of choice just like we do. Angels don't have that faculty of choice. They are created to only obey God, so they will never commit a sin ever. But the jinn are conscious beings just like us. And they are to choose to do good or to do bad. And they live in this world with us, and they will die as well, and they will be resurrected. But when they are in this world, we should not be in interaction with them. They can see us, we can't see them. This is what we call ghosts, basically. But those are not the souls of other people who lived on this earth. It's a different creation. And just because they are able to see us, we even believe that God has appointed one jinn for each person who lives. And that is the person that pushes you to do evil things. We depict them on the movies with, that, red thing with the two horns, something like that. It gets you closer to the idea, but there is somebody that is always with you, kind of enticing you to do bad things. And that person knows the most intimate things that nobody else knows except you. And those jinn have longer lives than we do. So those mediums, in a sense, they're talking to that being who knows everything about that person who died. So they know that the grandma had a box where she wrote something and that went on the fire. So that's why they're able to tell people, by the way, that box that your grandma gave you, like, oh, how did you know that? Nobody was with us and I never told somebody. Well, it's not that your grandma is there or her soul is there. We believe it's just that
No Wi-Fi.
No red tooth.
Can I ask you a question?
Can you ask me a question? No. You can ask me a question. Go ahead.
From an Old Testament position, you got Saul going to the witch at Endor to conjure up the spirit of the dead. And that's not denied any place, Old Testament and New Testament. I'm just saying what to do with it. In the New Testament, you got Jesus giving the story of Dives, or the rich man, and Lazarus. And you have communication of Lazarus from whether it's Hades, or intermediate soul sleep, or the grave, with indication it's afterlife. But you've got a story Jesus gives that is happening. But maybe the biggest question I've had, those who proclaim to be followers of Christ are going to say, Christ speaks to me, I hear him, he instructs, he leads me. You're dealing with a person who was died, buried, and resurrected, and that's someone on the other side. If you believe God actually speaks to you now. I'm not trying to answer it, but you've got at least three biblical experiences that you've got to deal with. I'd like to bodily, all of us talk about this intermediate state of soul sleep or purgatory or bodily existence between death and end of history or second coming that we deal with. But I'm just, there are at least three understandings of Scripture that you got to deal with somehow. And I'm asking you because I don't know the answer to it. I just know the text right there.
What's the question? The specific question.
You asked, is it possible for communication? And I think those three texts would at least indicate there may be some realm of possibility that's there.
I mean, I do think there's some kind of communion, even on a physical level, because we inherit our parents' genes, our very makeup, and they're part of us. My mother always said I walk like my father. Not really a compliment. Right? I mean, you carry on. Your parents are still with you in a certain way.
I've got a grounding question that I was asked.
Yeah.
One of the worst places in the world to be is arguing theology at the dinner table at seminary, right? It's purgatory or hell, however you want to define it. But when you get out, from my experience, getting out into the real world after a number of years of study and excitement, all the study and excitement really gets put to the fire quickly in the study, and it falls away and it finds its true form. The study's important, it's all that, but real world kind of tortures it. Within the first 2 years, it might have been the first year, probably the second year, a woman came into my office who had just lost one of her sons. And she said, "Where is my son?" You know, like, okay, showtime, go. Like, and there was nothing I had. I went through and kind of did a very conscious of doing a little sort of pastoral talk, trying to understand where she was emotionally, not just being dry academic, but in trying to reach for some academic things that I could kind of fit into this mold. But there was no clear answer that I could speak to her where she was and what she was longing for. And that experience of death, and there is a veil, right? The veil has been torn open. In the Christian tradition, we say the veil, we see through it in Christ in the resurrection. But for us, there's a whole lot that we don't know. And in our tradition, there's a great piece of reverencing the unknown, of not trying to define the realm of God, right? In a lot of the Catholic pro-life positions, that's where we stand. Like you can't. Okay, nobody knows when life begins. Hands off. You know, nobody knows when the soul leaves the body. Right? Be very, very careful about doing anything there. We're okay not knowing because it's not for us to know. We don't claim that authority on everything. But that was a real world question, a real hard question from the woman, and there was no answer I could give her because I couldn't take away the experience. She was separated from her son. I couldn't take away that experience of death, and that's what she wanted to know. How can I do that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's have some questions. Or panel.
Yeah, I mean, you asked whether people behave as though they believe there is a hereafter or not. I think that answer is very straightforward. And I'm surprised, why the panel is a yes or no question, basically. And the answer is no. They do not. If they had believed, they would have been behaved, so nicely, the world would have been really paradise. If they really believe there is a consequence. Either, they do not believe, most people, or they forget time to time, or, they are not aware of it, or there is no awareness.
So Tom is saying that the way people act, he's saying that people act as if there's nothing. They're just kind of oblivious to anything after life. So let's see what the panel has to say. Rabbi.
Okay, well, so God gave us free will, and that's a big, it's a big issue, because if God gave us the wherewithal and the understanding that we are able to do the things that we want, that we have our own choice as to how we are going to live our lives, then what we in Judaism we say there's Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer HaRa, which are talking about having the two things on our shoulders. Basically, you have the inclination to do good and you have the inclination to do bad, and being able to balance those two is how you're going to live your life on the earth. And so that having free will allows us to be, as human beings, in control of what we believe and how we act on the earth. I guess not taking faith out of it entirely, because you do have to have a belief system in something, but that you are able to, that we have the ability to be able to think on our own, that we don't have, that God, in a sense, is not in control of every single thing that we do on the earth. Because if that were the case, then there wouldn't be individuals, and certainly there wouldn't, I don't believe, would be any differences in religion at all. I mean, everyone would just be living in the image of God, which we say is B'Tselem Elohim. But in our faith tradition, and specifically in Reform Judaism, that we are able to question God's motives. And that differentiates us between more traditional forms of Judaism, whereas we're able to say, well, God gave us free will. We are able to make mistakes in our lives, whether we learn from them and move on, or we're stuck back in that particular place of doing wrong and not learning a lesson, or being okay with not learning a lesson. But God allowed us to have that idea of free will and be able to make those decisions on our own. The aftermath of that is what's going to change in what you believe and what happens after you die.
Anyone else want to respond to Sultan's point?
Respectfully, I disagree with your premise. I think biblically and most recent psychology will indicate belief doesn't determine behavior. Behavior states your belief. What you do is what you believe. For instance, with my congregation, I don't ask their doctrinal beliefs. I said, I don't care about your doctrinal beliefs. You three, hold on a minute before you can crucify me. I said, I want to see two things. Let me see your checkbook and your calendar. And what you spend your money on and your time doing tells me all I need to know about your views of God. Your behavior states your belief. James said it this way: I'll show you my faith by my works. For me to claim I love God and not love all peoples is impossible. I'll show you how much I love God by the way I love people. Not how many times I sing the song, Oh, How I Love Jesus, or how many times I recite a prayer. Behavior states your belief, but belief does not determine your behavior. I can show you Protestants all over this country that claim what they believe, and they support lying and immorality and not caring for the poor. They're theological. Turn your camera off. They're theological liars. Your behavior states your belief, not what you pontificate from your mouth.
But you supported my point of view, though.
Good, then I misunderstood.
That's good what he's saying, because he's saying the way people think. His point is the way people act.
Educated dinner afterwards.
The term I like for that phenomenon, without trying to answer where it comes from, is a practical atheism is a term for part of that phenomenon. We see that people who say, I believe in God, but they live as if God doesn't exist, right? In my experience in my own life, and what I've seen in others, I reconcile with it sort of like the long game of cognitive dissonance, right? That we can get along for a while believing two opposite things and not quite seeing the impossibility of that. And it usually comes about when that cognitive dissonance is broken down, if it's rooted in reality, right? That you're really misunderstanding two different things. It's a painful experience when one realizes, I'm not the good person I thought. I preach, justice is for us following God's law, following the law of revelation, following the law in a civil thing, in a civil society that's resonant with natural law. But if I speed through a red light, I usually cover my collar so no one sees me. There's a dissonance in day-to-day stuff. What I see in maturity, as in the Christian maturing in his life, or we would put this in, you'd also put it in human terms, is coming to really know yourself and be able to speak honestly about who you are. So people can get away with that, cognitive dissonance, and they really do believe two things, but there will be a reckoning when that will be resolved. We call that judgment, too, at the end.
Maybe that's what integrity is, the different parts being integrated, everything knitting together, so there isn't that distance.
I just learned enough that I can't put myself forward as integrated. So, yeah.
Okay, but let's remember the Imam's very good description of the scale. And there's an invisible scale hovering over you with good deeds and bad deeds, but it's invisible. So let's go back to his question. What if all of a sudden that scale were made visible and you knew how many more good deeds you would have to get to heaven? Or if you knew what the deficit was. Come on. You know that if that scale were visible, that would change someone's behavior. If I knew that I have this many bad deeds, and if I only had to do this more, you know that would affect my life.
I would do
But
that.
I would start doing more good deeds.
I think I just give up.
But it's visible. We don't know. There's an uncertainty. But I think what Armin's trying to say is if it were visible, if we knew for sure where that scale were, then I think our lives would be different. Yeah.
I think you're exactly where Martin Luther was, and you can understand. It doesn't matter what the scale is, I can't make it. There's an unrighteous, no, not one. That
Not
is
according to his tradition, though.
That's right. I'm answering for my tradition.
That's why you
He's
do that.
asking you. You got a better answer for it because I'm going to tell you it didn't work.
What if that scale were visible to all of us?
I think the denial is part of human nature. that scale is visible in a lot of aspects of our life. People who go to school, they know how much grade they need to get an A, and they still don't put the effort to get an A. So in a sense, that scale is there. It's real, but we still don't always act on it. Even those who have the most strong faith might not be working according to that scale, even though they know that it exists as if they are seeing it. So I will go back to try to explain a little bit on that point, expand a little bit on that point, that at the end of the day, yes, there is no one deed or group of deeds that you could do to match the bounty of God on you. So you'll never be able to repay what God has given us. So in that sense, I agree with you. But I was trying to talk to another point. That's why I didn't explain that much. But nobody will enter paradise because of what they did. There's a saying of the prophet that tells us a story about a man who all his life he worshipped God, didn't do anything else. He lived under a tree, and he was content by drinking water that was close by, a river close by, and eating from fruits from that tree all his life. All his life, he didn't do anything else. So when he got the day of judgment, God says, "Take my servant to paradise with my mercy." He said, "Your mercy? I worshipped you all my life with my deeds." I said, "Okay, well, if you want to count the deeds, come back. Let's do that scale." So again, talking about the scale, it just started with the bounty of sight. They put the bounty of sight, and that overweighted everything he did on his life. People who wear glasses maybe have more understanding of that, because that's very expensive to do. So the point here is that no one could repay the bounty that God has bestowed on us. But nevertheless, because of the free will we have, we are accumulating good deeds and bad deeds. And you will, with the mercy of God, He will allow you, if you have enough good deeds that overweigh your bad deeds, to go to paradise. If you have the opposite, not only that you didn't do well, but you were not grateful for what God gave you. So that's kind of double bad things you did. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Okay, Carl?
All right, so kind of take it back to where you asked about this man's inherent ability to intuit reason and afterlife for God. And I'm kind of throwing this to Father Travis, but anybody take it if you want. C.S. Lewis, in his kind of discourse on how to reason God, said that with every urge that man has, there's a satisfaction for it. You get hungry, you eat. You get thirsty, you drink. Even there's with the sexual urge, there's something to meet it, and that it follows that if we have an urge, this longing, this looking up, then that must mean that there's something else. So I wanted to ask if through anthropology we can look back over because you mentioned like kind of pagan season cycles and things like that. We can look back even to like the earliest reaches of the most primitive ritual of burial or whatever, and we can say, oh look, you believe that that is a sort of like a lineage, kind of like even like the comparative to the growth of an individual that goes back from this most primitive understanding and kind of mature, or do you believe that it's kind of something we're kind of projected backwards onto?
I don't know. I don't know for sure. Looking back, but that satisfaction. If I could just speak to that real quick. Looking for satisfaction. What might that look like in the what I would say a universal thirst for the divine? I think historically we might say that it looks like sacrifice, and it looks like a lot of ugly sacrifices in different things, in different cultures. I've listened to my nephews philosophize about the world, and they're 5, and I'm like, they really believe themselves. That's crazy. and I've looked at my own life when I've, back the 5 times I thought I figured everything out that exists, is that there is an error that we're capable of in trying to describe that mysterious thirst and looking for a release. To put it in the Christian example, in the Old Testament example, my brother called me after one Sunday liturgy, and because we all have the same scriptures in the Mass, and he was like, they get mad at me about something that's like I did it. He goes, "It didn't make sense. Abraham and Isaac, that God would ask him to kill his son. That doesn't sound like what God would. Why would he even believe that?" And I said, well, yeah, but that was kind of new, and that's why what we have in a tradition, in a Judeo-Christian model, have accepted that's some part of Revelation about who God is, that He's not going to ask you to sacrifice your son. Now, of course, it goes into we can point to Christianity in the sacrifice of Christ, right? But from a standpoint of when we look at world religions, sacrifice is a constant theme. And sometimes it's really, really ugly. And sometimes when there's a better form of worship that comes in, a different culture that comes in, thank God we don't have to sacrifice our kids to alleviate the divine wrath, right? We just have to fast for 40 days, something like that. So I think it does point to a universal thing inside. I can't. From a Christian standpoint, I say, yeah, they're doing the best they can with what they have, right? That sounds a little condescending, but that's because I believe that on my own, I would believe the same and live a kind of Lord of the Flies kind of life. God entering into the world, breaking through that, and how to satisfy that thirst. That's where the core of my faith is.
So human reason can kind of get there, but it's kind of like Paul in Romans, where he says God's made it apparent to them, they just kind of fell short of it.
Plato's famous light in the cave, allegory in the cave. That's a description of how we politely talk about people who don't believe the same thing we do, that they're not quite there, they don't understand it, I would say that's without the light of Christ.
One more question? Okay. It's a light question to Rabbi.
Sure.
I have a Jewish friend.
Okay.
Taught me a trick. The trick is that, if there is a hereafter, all I have to say that I am a Jew, okay? And then there is not going to be, all Jew will go to heaven. Is that kind of...
No. No. I mean, it's the same. It's coming to the same. That's a very blanketed statement as to if you just say that you're a Jew and that you'll go to heaven. We don't. That's not what we believe. I think that your friend was mistaken in that.
There is a covenant between God and Jew, I think, of that sort. Is that what it is?
Well, yes, that we. I mean, as if you read. If you read the Torah, if you read the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that Jews believe that we are that the Scripture says that we are the chosen people. This is where Reform Judaism kind of differentiates. We as Jews try to get a little bit, as Reform Jews, try to get a little bit less away from that idea of chosenness. We don't like being put into that bubble, in a sense. No, so your friend's saying that if you on your deathbed, if you say that you're Jewish, that you will go to heaven. That's not theologically what we believe. But we do have. But on the other hand, with that sense in mind, when we hear that there have been when perhaps people have been baptized post-mortem, it's kind of like that idea. You have to have a belief system before you go. that you don't just.
It's Ash Wednesday after Mardi Gras.
It's kind of like, you're going to fool God? God's not going to know that you're just saying it to go to heaven. It's almost like forgiveness on your deathbed.
No, that's our classic.
He knows.
You mean I can go get drunk on Friday,
Yeah.
go to confession on Saturday, and then go to church on Sunday? All things good?
But at least this would have been easier to go to heaven. I mean, one easy way to.
But that being said, it's the process of converting to Judaism is not an easy process at all. So you can't. So it's you can't just say poof. I'm a Jew, kind of thing. So no, you can't.
If I may,
Go ahead. I want to hear.
because
I want to hear you go then.
because it's just in contrast.
Yes, right.
So our belief system actually revolves around the understanding that faith by itself is not enough, and actions by themselves are not enough. You have to have faith and actions. So to have faith in Jesus as the Son of God, for example, or to have believe that you're a Jew and that will get you to heaven, in Islam is not acceptable. So even if you say you're a Muslim, it does not get you anywhere unless you do actions. So as you were pointing out rightly, that the actions you do actually reflects what you believe. So if you are truly a good believer in God, then you will act accordingly. But the point here is that faith by itself in Islam is not enough. It's important, it's fundamental, but it's not enough. And actions also, as good as they could be, they are not enough if they're not based on faith. I'll give you an example, because we all have different common sense. What is common sense of good to you might not be the same to me. So I might be thinking that I'm doing something good, but at the same time I might be hurting you, because our common sense are different. So that's why we would resort to faith as instructed to us by the Prophet as the model, as the example. This is good, this is bad. There is something gray in the middle, and if you get to that, stay in the clear side. Don't be close to that dark area. And basically, this is in a very, I hope, simple terms, the philosophy of Islam, that both actions and faith are important.
I think that you could say that of all of the basis of our faith. That it's not just about, words, it's about action. And, we are united in a lot of fronts, far more than we are separated. We all go into our little separate ways, but I mean the basis of, I think that we could all say that the basis of our deeds and our faith and our faith in our faith is what unites us.
There is no shortcut here.
No.
Sorry. I like to say it's a light question.
If the four different faiths or religions or traditions represented, it seems like everyone's worshiping the same God. Is that correct?
That was the topic of a whole discussion a few months ago.
Well, what I was going to say for the afterlife. So, why does it matter which faith you worship? Because we all worship God, and we do, our faith and our deeds, and we want to get to the afterlife. Why does it make a difference what faith we follow?
Are you pointing at
Just to
somebody?
Well, as I said before, Judaism believes that everyone will go to heaven. So that's the end of my discussion. So whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian,
I think we have to agree that the premise of what you're saying is that God has told a group of people to do certain acts, and then they will get to paradise. And he told another group of people to do something slightly different. And went to another group and told them to do something completely different. And then at the end, they will all go to heaven. That's kind of contradictory to God being wise and logic. Because that would be like God is playing games with us. Why didn't he just told us all to do the same thing? Which in Islam we believe that he did. That he basically told everybody the same thing. Religion is manifest through prophets to give us a model of life. Okay, so this abstract idea of worshiping God, how do we practice it? When our son dies, or when we have a tragedy, or when we are happy. How do we do that? It's an abstract idea of worshiping God. So he sent to us the prophets to model that behavior and to model that abstract idea into, real things in our life. And then the sense of that idea is that those who were sent were men, so that we can relate to them. Were people like us who had feelings, who had families, who had needs, who had griefs, or grieved, who felt happy. So the answer to that in Islam is that people changed the word of God throughout history, and that's why God kept sending us his word again and again. And in its core, it's the same thing, that there's only one creator, one God. You all need to worship that one God, and that's the way to salvation. But when people came and changed that, then God sent another reminder, and then another reminder, and another reminder, till we believe he sent the final reminder, that was the Prophet Muhammad, to kind of approve of all the messengers that came before him, in the sense they all asked people to worship God, and then also give us the final model of how now that humans have evolved to this level of intellect and sophistication and all that, this is what's going to fit your life when you are practicing this worshiping God.
And we as Jews do not believe that figure has come yet into being.
We'll draw the line differently.
Right. So we're talking about timeline.
I'm guessing, are you Protestant or Catholic?
I'm a converted Catholic from Protestant.
I would no. I wish many Protestants would simply get converted. I'm for that also. I want a story from the Gospels. I think you'll understand. The sons of thunder, James and John, were upset one day with a religious body doing it a lot different than they were doing it. And they turned to Jesus, do you want us to go over and take care of it? Correct them, punish them, eliminate them. And Jesus responds to these two personalities that were very angry. And he said, no, leave it alone. If it's of God, he'll do it. If it's not of God, he'll handle it. In essence, involved winning and battle. Get your hands off. And I think sometimes we want to handle things that are for God to handle. You want to go to the parable of the soils. He says, don't be pulling up the roots of the good seed, or the seed that may be a half-breed, or a weed. You mess it all up. There are things that need to be left to God. And I think judging each other's religion sometimes needs to be left with God. You know she represents Jews for God. You know the M believes in a monotheistic God. I'm the protester. You know, I've always been, I'm really not Baptist anymore because of some issues there. I do word studies in New Testament, Old Testament. You know the tradition of Catholicism and Protestant and the tradition. As she said, there's a lot more in common in our understanding God and how to serve God than there are differences. And I think sometimes fighting over the differences is totally destructive. Now, you may call me too big.
I agree with the argument that arguing over differences is not really constructive. I do have I think a different take on that question. A good friend of mine was Catholic, and he married a Baptist girl, and he had this and he came and talked to me about it just in passing. He wasn't looking for any advice. But I answered him because he just was telling me his great compromise is that they went to the Methodist church. And I get that, right? I get that, because there's one thing, some people just, anything but Catholic. Or fill in the blank, whatever it is. And I told him, my only response was, that's like trying to pick your doctor based on his parking lot. He has the best parking, I'm going to go to this doctor, right? There's something missing in that equation. And fundamentally, it would be, do you believe it's true? And so there's a premise to that question: is that is truth knowable, or do we have truth claims? And if we claim that nobody knows what's going on, and there's all the differences are there, but they're not that much, and just take what you will. I'm paraphrasing rather sloppily. But there's a direct challenge against this idea that I want to know what's true, and can God communicate that to me, right? Obviously, from the goodness that's around and people who disagree, we know it's more complicated than just, oh yeah, I got that, I'm on the right bus, right? So from a Catholic perspective, what we recognize is not that, if you're not Catholic, you're not going to hell. I mean, you're not going to heaven. If you're not baptized with a Trinitarian baptismal formula, then you're not going to heaven. We recognize that people through their own, without fault, do not receive the gospel, then they're not accounted as damned, right? Now that's rooted in a happy ignorance, if you will. It's not rooted in that, well, nobody knows what's going on anyways, so just do your best. A lot of us live that way, and so I'm not throwing stones at us who have that sort of outlook. But that's not what we teach. We teach that if it's an ignorance, God doesn't damn us for ignorance. There is a natural search for the good and evil. Even if we have cognitive dissonance, we can do bad things, and I think we will come to terms with that in judgment. But that's not the happy ignorance. That's pure sin, or wrongness, or evil, however you want to define it. So that's what we are. I don't think I'm disagreeing with you guys per se, but we say it's an ignorant moment that he's a good person, but he just doesn't know the truth. I think that's a repetitious statement we could probably all agree.
Do you think that if God just manifested himself with absolute clarity, and cleared all this up, would that somehow, might that actually deprive us of something or make us less than we are?
Well, I could answer the question that comes up: why Adam and Eve? If we're going to use a Judeo-Christian model, why Adam and Eve? Why wasn't there? Why did he create heaven? Why did he create paradise with a choice? What's that about? In the final answer for us, we see that the life here is a participation in God's redeeming, creative and redeeming word. That we somehow help build ourselves, if you will. We cooperate with God's grace to choose life, to choose love, to choose eternity. And I can expand my capacity for God's life and love in this life, for the next life, by choosing to do good and generous things. And so, why does there's that space in between God's creation and a happy ever after? What do we do in that? That's the $1,000,000 question. But that's where Catholicism teaches us. Is that an answer to the question? I go off the wrong track.
Catholic background. John 14:6. Does that ring any bells? John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, usually truth gets defined as doctrinal truth, concepts. The New Testament talks about truth as a person. Truth is a relationship. It's not a body of beliefs. It's a walk with God. I am the truth. It's capital, definite article, all those grammatical. Then you begin asking the question, is a lot of this semantics? Yahweh, Elohim, Son of God, Son of Man, Meshach, Messiah, the Christ, Jesus, in our human fallen flesh, sometimes we would just mess things up with semantics. There is the truth, and that's a relationship with the person. It is godness. Now, does God care what name we call him? Does it matter if it's an Arabic or Hebraic or English or a German term? And I think sometimes we're playing childish games in a sandbox. That the godness and the hugeness of God is much more than our limited fussing over some of this stuff. Prince, as a person, he and I probably doctrinally couldn't disagree more than anybody in the room. But knowing him, I have the utmost respect and confidence in who he is as a person, his commitment with the Lord and doing right things. And the same with the other two. I come back, I think it's who you are, not what you are. That was the difference. But I'm going to get some.
Are we? Okay, I think we better conclude our discussion. I want to thank our panel members very much for Dr. Wilson for putting all this together.
Yes, ma'am. What about you?